Hello, everyone. My name is Gönül Tol. I'm the director of the Middle East Institute's Turkey program and a senior fellow of the Frontier Europe initiative. Frontier Europe initiative was launched almost 1 year ago to explore interactions between the Middle East countries and parts of Eastern Europe, Central Asia, and the Caucasus, which form a frontier between Western Europe, Russia, and the Middle East. We are trying to examine the growing energy, trade, security, and political relationships to develop a greater understanding of the interplay between these strategically very important regions. And I'm very proud of being part of the Frontier team. Please check out our website to know more about our excellent work. So I welcome you all to today's very timely and important webinar. As we've all been following one of the world's most intractable conflicts over the disputed region of Nagorno-Karabakh has blown up again. The recent fighting between Azerbaijan and Armenia is the most serious escalation of conflict in years and has now spilled into its 11th day of violence. The recent conflict threatens to plunge both parties into a full-scale war, and the situation is more complicated by external powers increasing their involvement in the region and the failure of mediation efforts. So today we have a group of experts who will discuss the nuances of the ongoing conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan, as well as the role regional countries like Georgia, Russia, and Turkey play in it. First, we have Neil Hauer. He is a non-resident scholar at MEI's Frontier Europe initiative and a journalist and analyst based in Georgia. Next, I'm pleased to introduce Victor Kipiani. He is the chair of a Georgian think tank called GeoCase. And finally, I would like to welcome Maxim Suchko. He is a non-resident scholar in the Conflict Resolution and Track 2 Dialogues program at MEI and a senior fellow and associate professor at the Moscow State Institute of International Relations. I look forward to taking audience questions through Zoom's Q&A feature, which you can all find on your screens. And for those calling in by phone or watching our panel on the live stream, you can ask a question by emailing events@mei.edu. And please feel free to ask a question at any time. Throughout the panel, I will be looking at all of your questions and will factor as many as possible into the discussion. So with that, let's kick off the discussion. I would like to start with you, Neil. You are in Armenia at the moment. So please tell us what you're seeing on the ground. Just recently, Armenian Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan said on Tuesday that his country could make concessions over the Nagorno-Karabakh region if Azerbaijan was ready to do the same. So is the conflict escalating, or are there signs of de-escalation?
Thanks for that, Gono, and thanks for having me today. I think, unfortunately, that just about everything we have so far points towards continued escalation. And a lot of that is due to the fact that, even though Nikol Pashinyan has made this rather unprecedented comment yesterday, suggesting that concessions could be possible from the Armenian side, the rhetoric coming from the Azerbaijani camp and the Turkish camp and the sort of goals that they've laid out indicate that by all means that they're seeking a lot more. I mean, they've done quite a bit of military damage already to the Armenian and Karabakh forces. They've made some limited gains on the ground, but they're talking about, full liberation and finally ending the Karabakh problem, the Karabakh question. And, the sense that I get from Azerbaijan, from the government, this is the government's messaging. And then this is, I think, the sense in Azerbaijani society as well, too, is that, it's been 30 years now that we've been dealing with this. We've been in negotiations for almost that entire time, and they've gotten us nowhere. And we're not going to wait another 30 years. It's time to resolve this by military force, since the Armenians have left with no choice. And so from that point of view, I think without some major major outside intervention or diplomatic intervention, I think that it's likely to escalate a lot more.
That's, well, both parties accuse each other for starting the latest round of clashes, but the consensus seems to be that Azeris launched the first attack. What is your sense?
Yeah, I think that all the evidence at this point essentially indicates that this was not only the Azerbaijanis initiated it, but it was fairly well planned in advance, for the weeks leading up to it. Essentially following there was some small clashes in July that broke out actually along the Armenia-Azerbaijan border proper, not in Karabakh, but about 100 kilometers to the north. And that was in July. Those were smaller scale, and the consensus was that those were accidental and just broke out. But following that, I mean, Turkey really got involved in terms of saying that for the first time, essentially, that they're going to fully back Azerbaijan unequivocally in the conflict. They held the military games with Azerbaijan, and then the rhetoric from those two sides continued to ramp up. And in the weeks beforehand, Azerbaijan was making this list of grievances that they're issuing. And then they began importing the Syrian mercenaries, which seemed like a shocking development and really hard to believe for everyone watching the region. But now we have evidence that proves beyond a doubt that that's true. And these guys were arriving. And then the most important indicator, I think, is that about 48 hours before the conflict broke out, on September 27th, the U.S. Embassy in Baku put out this warning to U.S. citizens to avoid all travel outside of the Absheron Peninsula, where Baku is located. So this seems to me that it was a well-planned Azerbaijani backed by Turkish offensive.
And I want to come back to Neil to what kind of concessions was the Armenian Prime Minister talking about? But before that, I want to say a few things about Turkey. As you just pointed out, there is a new factor in the current conflict, and that is Turkey's greater involvement. Well, obviously, Turkey has always supported Azerbaijan because of the ethnic kinship, but Turkey's support has mostly been political. But this time around, Turkey is willing to back Azeris militarily. Everyone else, the EU, Russia, and the United States have all called for an end to the fighting, while Turkey urged Azeris to fight on. And Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan was very clear. He condemned calls for a ceasefire from the Minsk group and said that until Armenia ends its occupation of Azeri territory, a ceasefire will just lead to a future conflict. So the Turks are now saying that they're ready to help Azeris secure the enclave, and it's supplying Azeris with drones. And as you mentioned, according to some reports, Syrian mercenaries are there. Armenia accuses Turkey of downing its warplane. And Turkey denies all these, but given Turkey's track record in transferring Syrian mercenaries to other conflict zones, such as Syria, and given the fact that Turkey is the third biggest supplier of arms and military equipment to Azerbaijan, none of these things are out of the realm of possibility. So why is Turkey so ready to get involved militarily? In my view, Erdogan has been using foreign policy to divert attention away from his domestic problems. Economy is not doing well. There's a surge in COVID cases. There are splinter parties launched by his former allies. And most important of all, he's losing ground in the polls. And he faces several complications on other foreign policy fronts. So when things don't go as planned at home, Erdogan turns to foreign policy to shore up his base. He's been using hard power to press his interest at home since 2015, and that was when his party lost a parliamentary majority for the first time in over a decade. He intervened in Syria right after a coup attempt that shook the country in 2016, and 2 more times after that to galvanize the nationalists. Then he militarily intervened in Libya and sent the Turkish Navy to change the status quo in the Eastern Mediterranean. But he's not really reaping the domestic benefits of these militaristic foreign policy moves, because he was forced to back down in the Eastern Mediterranean most recently. Turkey-backed military assault to capture key central Libyan towns stalled, and not much is happening in Syria that Erdogan can tell as a success story. So helping Azeris capture territory burnishes his nationalist credentials at a time when he was forced to back down in other foreign policy issues. And I think also there's the issue of energy. Azerbaijan has recently replaced Russia as Turkey's biggest gas supplier. And Azeris hosts critical energy and transportation infrastructure. Baku supplies Turkey with natural gas and crude oil via pipelines that pass within 10 miles of the border, Armenia-Azerbaijan border, and 30 miles of the conflict zone. So a disruption in the supply would have negative repercussions for Turkey. And finally, there is also the military dimension to what Turkey is doing. Azeri parliament approved a bill on financial assistance from Turkey that will be used to purchase weapons from Turkish manufacturers. It hasn't been publicized, but it's rumored that Azerbaijan plans on buying dozens of Bayraktar TB2 drones. And most recently, Azeri president acknowledged that. He admitted that Azeri forces were using Turkish drones. And Selçuk Bayraktar, by the way, who is the owner of this drone manufacturer, he is also Erdogan's son-in-law. And he expressed his support for Azerbaijan by retweeting a video of the Azeri military's drone strikes in the conflict region. So you have that dimension, military dimension too. And moving forward, Turkey's MO in these conflicts has been to get involved militarily in an effort to change the military dynamics on the ground fast, so that it can have a stronger hand at the negotiation table. That was the goal in Syria, that was the goal in Libya and Eastern Mediterranean. But things have not played out as Erdogan had hoped. In all of these conflicts, Turkey's military involvement prompted other external players to double down on their military engagement and mobilize a strong anti-Turkey diplomatic front, which eventually forced Erdogan to back down and give up on his maximalist demands. I mean, for instance, Turkey militarily intervened in Libya to support the GNA and El-Sarraj government. The GNA forces advanced militarily and fenced off an attack from Haftar's forces on Tripoli. But Turkey's involvement prompted Egypt, the UAE, France, and Russia to increase their involvement in the conflict, and even led to cracks within the GNA. And similarly, in the Eastern Mediterranean, Turkey's militaristic policy prompted the European countries as well as regional adversaries such as like Egypt and the UAE to throw their support behind Greece. The EU even threatened sanctions. And finally, Turkish drilling ships returned home. So a similar scenario may play out in Nagorno-Karabakh, I think. So if Turkey deepens its involvement, that might prompt Russian involvement. There's already an anti-Turkey consensus emerging, with France joining Russia in criticizing Turkey-led Syrian fighters' transfer to the conflict zone. So I think here it's really critical to understand what Russia is going to do. So that's why I want to turn to you, Max. Can you tell us first, what is at stake for Russia in the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict?
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be with you. It's a very timely and important issue that we're discussing here. Few things, if I may. One that has to do with Russia's kind of own interest in Russia's own policies over the last few days, as far as conflict is concerned. And the other part has to do with how Russia perceives Turkey's actions and what it thinks it can do to deter or embrace Turkey. That's, I think, it's definite bifurcation point where Russia is now at, whether to deter or to embrace whatever Turkey seeks to be doing in the region. So as far as Russia itself is concerned, definitely Russia sees Armenia, and it's a treaty ally, right? Russia has own commitments to protect Armenian security under the Collective Security Treaty, CSTO organization, the Russia-led kind of security alliance in the post-Soviet space, which embraces Russia, Belarus, Armenia, Tajikistan, Kazakhstan, and Kyrgyzstan. And Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan are obviously the two Turkic-speaking nations that are definitely not happy to jump in and to fight for Armenia protected. So I think there is one important track that Russia is doing or working on right now, is to try to build legitimacy for a potential involvement in the conflict. And by doing and there you have this different kind of kabuki dancing on that, Karabakh is not covered by CSTO mandate. As far as the conflict is going on there, Russia will stay away because under the international law, Karabakh is still, the territory of Azerbaijan occupied by Armenia. So Russia is careful about, stretching too far and saying we're going to provide military aid to defend Karabakh. On the other hand, you have, all these discussions that Armenia has not reached out to Moscow directly to ask for military support. Not directly, not via bilateral channels, neither nor via the CSTO channels. So this is kind of important. Now, be careful what you wish for. Obviously, if Armenia does that, then Russia will have perhaps a harder choice of how to say yes or how to say no, right? So, but so far it hasn't happened. So Kremlin is careful about, trying to build the legitimacy. They have all this kind of traditional diplomatic talk about the two parties needing to ceasefire immediately, and all these kind of hostilities be settled through Minsk OSCE group. This is one part of it. Now there is also kind of a narrative and a political case that Russia wants to build around it, and it's very interesting that a person who is most outspoken on this issue is Russia's foreign intelligence chief, Sergei Narishkin, who's been talking as yesterday about Russia being very concerned about the presence of foreign mercenary forces, and he didn't specify. They called out three groups in particular. They called them terrorists and radicals, even though they're not officially listed on Russia's radicals and terrorist list. But they made it clear that they're fighting for that they're brought there from Syria by Turkey. But they also specified that Russia is concerned about the presence of Kurdish fighters, kind of to placate to the Turkish narrative that the Kurdish fighters are allegedly fighting for Armenia. So even in this kind of track, Russia wants to stay neutral and to strike a right balance to maintain, most importantly, this role of an unbiased mediator, right? The one that both parties can turn to.
Nice. I'm sorry to intervene, but I just want, sorry to interrupt, but just to clarify, so he was the only Russian official who called out on these groups, right? Both the PKK.
Well, no, because previously there was the statement by the foreign ministry, but they didn't provide the specific names.
Okay.
They said Russia, spotted that there was the militants transferring from Syria and Libya. The foreign ministry Libyan statement said, the foreign ministry statement said. But he specified the three groups, made it clear they were transferred from Syria, and it's very important that he's the one doing this, making these statements, because when the intelligence chief is making these statements, they usually don't ask for proof. Because I see some question over there, like, are there any proof? Because the intelligence guy may always say, this is our intel. We're not sharing our sources and things like this. So this is kind of important point to make. Also, there are all the speculation that Russia allowed for this attack, or there was agreed something that Turkey to punish Pashinyan. I don't think this is the case yet. However, I think there is very important kind of intricacy going on that with Russia, and this is my own theory, of course, that Russia is trying to adopt and apply the lessons it learned in Syria in that how it managed its relationship with Assad to its relationship with Pashinyan, right? I don't think anyone makes it a big secret that there is no love lost between Putin and Pashinyan. Pashinyan is looked with suspicion in Russia. All these theories that he's came to power as a result of a Kali revolution, supported by Soros and all that. But in this kind of domain, I think it's important that Moscow really makes Pashinyan make these calls every single day and discuss with Putin the difficult situation that Armenia is in, to ensure that he doesn't get the type of treatment that Assad got back in the day, thinking, it may actually provide a leeway for Russia to navigate in the mediation space between Turkey and Azerbaijan in the future. And I think Aliyev made a very important comment when he was interviewed by Al Arabiya the other day, praising Russia's efforts within the Minsk group. And also Erdogan, and this brings me to my comments about Turkey in particular, was criticizing the Minsk group and he was criticizing the co-chairs. But it's important to know that Turkey is also part of the Minsk OSCE group. They're not co-chairs along with Russia, France, and the USA, but they're part of the Minsk group as well. So, and I think this Turkey supporting Azerbaijan, if we're talking about, negotiation theory, is a position. But what is behind this position, and you provided your own kind of vision for why Erdogan is doing this, and the view in Russia is that Turkey wants to expand its influence in the former kind of Ottoman lands, and Caucasus is definitely very important for that. And this is not the first time Turkey is trying to increase its influence, because shortly after the war in Georgia in 2008, there was this Turkish initiative, Partnership for Peace and Stability, or Cooperation and Stability. I don't quite remember what it didn't really go anywhere. But now kind of Turkey inserts itself as a power that is willing to at least show force, and that's exactly what the Russian intelligence chief thought, according to Moscow's view, is very troublesome, because this is a new kind of factor that changes Russia's thinking of the conflict. So if we're thinking about possible kind of silver lining to where it all may be going, the view is that, maybe, with this new Turkish role, there might be a push towards reconsidering agreements and reconsidering the principles on where the settlement of the conflict was based upon over the last 30 years. But the key question and the key concern for Russia right now is whether to accept what Çavuşoğlu at some point referred to as kind of Syria-style deal with Russia over Karabakh, or to table reject it. It's interesting to see Putin has birthday today. He turned 68, and usually, you have all these different leaders making calls. I haven't yet seen Erdogan making a call to discuss that. And there is kind of, the view is that there might be kind of a game of chicken, who calls whom first, as there was the case in Syria and Libya, when the tensions were getting hot. Like Erdogan would most of the time reach out to Putin first. But now this isn't happening. But as far as we see here, there's a lot of this kind of thinking for Russia of it definitely does not want to accept the deal from Turkey as a Syria type of deal, because it thinks there are no conditions in Karabakh that they were similar to conditions in Syria that Russia wanted Turkey to be part of the deal together with Iran kind of on the Astana. Because Russia thinks it has enough leverage on both parties. It can address all these difficulties through the Minsk OSCE group, where it's co-chaired by France. Now, given the disagreements that you referred to between France and Turkey, Russian interests can actually be serviced much better than those of Turkey through the Minsk group. So Russia does not see any positive incentive for engaging with Turkey. However, the negative or disincentives for, say, if you're not engaging with Turkey, then Turkey may, activate its spoiler option and will make this front really hot for Russia. And that's definitely not what Moscow wants to do. But there are all these kind of constraints for Putin right now, because, getting involved is very costly domestically for him, perhaps even more costly than.
Yeah, I wanted to come to that, but in terms of Turkey becoming a spoiler in South Caucasus, it's Putin has seen this before. Turkey has done it in Libya, and Putin knows how to handle it. And as I said, Erdogan's MO has been like get involved militarily and then change the status quo, so you come to the table with a stronger hand. But in this case, as you said, I really don't. I've been hearing all kinds of arguments about why Russia has been quiet so far, and one of the arguments is that, Russia is not what it used to be. Putin is facing so many domestic challenges. He's been caught off guard. He's not really. He's dealing with so many problems at home that he's not really. He might give a pass to Erdogan. What do you think about that?
Well, somewhat counterintuitively, I would say Russia is more skillful playing afar from its borders than it's within its own kind of near abroad, right, as it's called, post-Soviet space. I would say Russian policy in the post-Soviet states is much more clumsy than it is in the Middle East, and has always been, whether you look at Ukraine or Belarus or the Caucasus or the Central Asia. So in a way, it's also a different set of people managing these policies, because the post-Soviet space is really looked upon as kind of continuation of Russia's own domestics. You know, it's not really seen as a foreign policy per se. And in that sense, the repercussions and the risks for Russia are much more higher in Karabakh than there are in Libya, for instance.
Yeah.
All the echoes that you may have in the North Caucasus as well. So when I was talking about Turkey playing a spoiler role, the concern is, say, about 10% of the Turkish population are, have come from the North Caucasus and different Turkic-speaking ethnic Circassians and many others. And they play somewhat important role, Turkish diaspora and many other things. So if Turkey is really wanting to make, this region difficult for Russia, it has all the resources, and I think Russian military toolbox is actually much more limited on that front than that of Turkey. So there's all these considerations, of course, of how to, delicately say "niet" to Turkey in Turkish. But then you can't, as I said, you can't really table reject the proposal. So my sense is that there will be some engagements at some point. But I think the calculation in Moscow is that Turkey has a long-term vision, or Erdogan, in that, it wants to restore Turkish kind of, reputation, regional power ambitions and all that stuff. And it usually has kind of a short-term plan of how to do it. But then once the plan hits, the obstacle, and we've seen that in Syria and Libya, then Turkey becomes more kind of susceptible to negotiations with "quote unquote" great powers, right? Or asking for Putin or for the United States to bail them out, to have a deal. So I think for now, Russia will continue kind of to what I would personally call the diplomacy of attrition, synonymic to war of attrition, ensuring that Turkey runs out of options to influence the situation politically. So it is constrained to either, in employ a military option, which also, cannot do or can, but will face a lot of repercussions on that side. Or, will be more kind of flexible to come to terms that favor Russian positions more than those of Turkey.
And also, I mean, it's really, as you mentioned, Matt, it's really tricky. It's trickier for Erdogan to get involved militarily in Nagorno-Karabakh, because Azeris, Aliyev wouldn't want that, given his delicate relationship with Russia. He recently said that they were using Turkish drones, but before he was very careful, saying, well, we thank our Turkish brothers, but they are backing us politically. There's no military support involved. So he's walking a really fine line, right, Neil? So Aliyev probably is in a very delicate situation here.
Yeah, I wanted to jump in on a few things. I'm following up on sort of what Maxim said with some of the viewpoints from Armenia that I'm seeing here. This ties into one of the questions I see that we've got here on is this something that maybe Russia's holding off here in order to punish Pashinyan for being a guy that they don't like or being somewhat pro-Western? And I don't really think that that's the case. I don't think that there's anything that Russia really wants from Pashinyan that they haven't already gotten. It's not like, this is not like some sort of, you can look at Maidan and there was in Ukraine, there was like the Eurasian Economic Union treaty that they wanted them to sign. Armenia is a full-fledged member of that. Armenia participates in all the Russian and CSTO military games. The only potential things I can think of that the Armenians didn't and that Pashinyan did not give the Russians the last year was the Russians wanted the Armenians to send military police to Syria, and they refused that, and they managed to just send medics and deminers. And then I think that the Russians have come out and specifically said that they don't like the persecution of Robert Kocharyan, the former president of Armenia from 1998 to 2008, who has been in and out of prison on a few different times, and the new administration has been trying him. But with regards to the view of Russia and the expectations that people have in Armenia for Russia, I think that they're actually quite low. I mean, I don't see many people here saying, I don't see much commentary saying that, you know, Russia is abandoning us, we're our allies, shouldn't they be helping us in this? I think people understood broadly that, you know, the same thing that Peskov said today, the Putin spokesman, that he underlined, saying that our pact with Armenia does not extend to Karabakh, to those territories. And I think that was the expectation here as well. So expectations were very low. And I mean, there's sort of an Armenian fatalism about it too, that, you know, we're always on our own against the world, so we don't expect much support. But in terms of the Russian support, I think it's really only expected, you know, to counter direct action against the Republic of Armenia on the territory itself. And there's been a little bit of that so far. You know, there's been a few incidents in Vardenis in eastern Armenia. There was a drone shot down a few days ago. There were some drones shot down north of Yerevan last week, but there's not been a huge amount of activity that's taken place anywhere near or on the territory of the Republic of Armenia itself. So I think that the Russians definitely do have still time to continue playing this waiting game, where the Armenians are not desperate enough yet to request their help in Karabakh, and there's no expectation explicitly for it.
I want to now turn to another regional country who has expressed interest in playing a mediator role in the recent conflict, and that's Georgia. Georgian Prime Minister recently released a statement saying Georgia is ready to mediate between the parties. Victor, I want to turn to you. First, please give us a little bit of a historical background to Georgia's stance on the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict. What has been Georgia's traditional policy vis-a-vis the conflict there?
Thank you, Gano. When we speak about the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict from the Georgian standpoint, it's really a very fine balance and very delicate balance which Georgia has to keep in this situation. Clearly, from the very start of the conflict in Nagorno-Karabakh, Tbilisi has always been pursuing the very basic and very transparent policy, which was about keeping an open-minded and then a good relationship with both Armenia and Azerbaijan. But in these circumstances, when this ethnic conflict, as if dropping, you know, the last vestige of the ethnicity and acquiring, you know, more geopolitical colors, definitely the challenge which Tbilisi is changing, you know, becomes much more sensitive and much more complicated. So it's one story to pursue a Georgian policy at the level of principles, which are quite universal and quite acceptable, which relates about extending humanitarian help, if any, to both parties involved without tilting to any side. That's one point. The second point, probably it's self-restraint, and that's also very obvious. Although this principle of self-restraint could be very hard to maintain the longer conflict lasts, and that could potentially become quite a quagmire and challenge for Georgian politicians. And the last point, which you just mentioned, it's about facilitating to the extent possible. And I'm emphasizing to the extent possible. Clearly, when Georgia has made an offer, Georgians were clearly realizing, you know, that offer would not be sort of, you know, a dominant offer, and therefore various caveats which were made that facilitation should and could be implemented all only within the international context, and that was clearly stipulated. So no one is cherishing, you know, the benign hopes that Tbilisi could or will eventually become the platform for dialogue. But at least, you know, for the purposes of good neighborhood, it was our moral duty, if you will, to make that offer, which we've been making over.
I want to get to that point, the role Georgia can play as a mediator. But before that, I have another question. there are several critical energy and transportation infrastructure that are going through Georgian territory. So, I mean, given the Georgian economy and given Georgia's past interactions with Russia, so what is really at stake for Georgia in case of a prolonged conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan?
So look, that's the point which I'm making, that the longer this conflict lasts, that sort of, peaceful or neutral balancing, I would put it this way, neutral balancing could be much harder to accomplish. You mentioned the pipelines, etc. Clearly, that interconnectedness and interdependency between Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Turkey, of course, has its own role. And when we speak about neutrality, those factors, of course, matter. That's one point. The second point, and the fellow speakers mentioned, clearly increasing role of Turkey in the region. What Georgia, from Georgian standpoint, what is considered as a sort of, the Russian domain, when we speak about South Caucasus, would that be a step in the direction of creating bipolar South Caucasus geopolitically? That's another question, and that's the question, which is very, very finite question, because to what level, that Turkish, I'm not saying aggressiveness, assertiveness would go on. I think, that's an issue which does not have a ready response at this point of time. So that's also the fact to consider. And then the last the point, probably not the very last, but also important, where is the West? So I think that when we speak about Georgia's approach and neutrality, militarily, politically, diplomatically, I think that Georgia will be holding the line as long as possible, unless the Western policy would not become more crystallized and more articulated. And that's indeed the challenge for Georgian politicians and foreign policy, because among various connotations, the Westless water in the Caucasus, or no man's land, or gray zones, or buffer areas, you really see, that with the tendency of the West retrenching or picking up, cherry picking, with regard to its foreign policy priorities, it could seem that the matters, the developments in South Caucasus could not be very much on the map of priority. And that is my personal concern. I could be wrong, but that's still, because my feeling, frankly, that when the West discusses what's happening in the South Caucasus, they do not have enough knowledge of the region, of its historical context, of its cultural context. And sometimes it seems to me, that the Caucasian studies, they examine as if, subdiscipline or adjacent, to Middle East or to the wider region. And I think, the Sub-Caucasus, which is systemic element for Eurasian security landscape, it's a very high time to sort of, to pick up or to separate that region and put that under the spotlight, in a separate manner. So all in all, I think, those factors, which, as I've said, at the level of principles, it's very easy for Tbilisi to state its official approach. But when it comes to implementing those principles,
that's going to be a
challenge. That's really a huge challenge, which we've never practiced before.
A question for you from the audience, Victor. The question is about Georgia has a substantial population of Armenians and Azeris, and how mobilized are these communities? Are they likely to push the Georgian government to take a side?
We had some, I'm not saying accidents, that would be exaggerating the phenomena, incidents in Java Keti day before. I personally would not had about any continuation in that respect over the course of the day. So hopefully, Yerevan should understand that keeping Georgia as a potential bridge, not just within the region, but with the outside, with the outer world, it's also in the best interest of Yerevan. So I think that Yerevan should apply, to put it very diplomatically and cautiously, its best efforts, not to provoke, not to instigate, any unwelcome developments in Javakheti. That's in the best interest of Yerevan. That's in the best interest of Tbilisi for obvious reasons. As far as the region of Nagorno-Karabakh, where the Azeri population resides, we have a relative peace so far. But again, when we speak about Georgia as a neutral platform, it's a neutrality directly, but same time, it's engagement indirectly, exactly because of the factor which you mentioned. Thousands, tens and ten thousands of Armenians and Azerbaijanis of Georgian nationality, of course. They reside, practically speaking, not side by side. So that's a challenge. That's a challenge for Georgia. And again, the last point, as you know, in difference from Armenia and Azerbaijan, Georgia has clearly articulated foreign policy objectives. And those foreign policy objectives are very much different from those stated by Yerevan.
What are those objectives?
The Euro-Atlantic integration, and fully fledged integration with the alliance. And I think that even though the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict is not happening in Georgia itself, but it somehow captures, that trajectory of Georgian foreign policy, because it undermines the stability in the region. It undermines the concept of win-win situation, and therefore it it hijacks the speed of reforms and the speed of the tempo of Georgian foreign policy. So again, we're neutral, but at the same time there are many nexuses whereby we're connected to what's happening on the ground. And then the very last point, I promise you, how much we could be planning, and how much, regardless how much we would be meticulous in our planning, it's a very key point that irrationality runs the world. So so much we speak about the rationalists, and same time, there is so high irrationality. And again, very much depends, what would be, technically speaking, the military status on the ground. Because that military status, the military developments could eventually dictate irrationality in political decisions. And then we've never tested, that the bromance of Turkey and Russia in the South Caucasus. We saw in Libya, we saw in Syria, and now, this is the third round in the row. And we see how that would be reflecting, in the context of South Caucasus. So that's probably my very brief response.
Well, thank you, Victor. Turning to you, Neil, there are...
Can I do an addendum to that? Because I think that's a really interesting topic.
Sure.
I think that this idea of, with the ethnic Armenian and the ethnic Azerbaijani populations in Georgia, and, especially the Armenian one that's been a little restless in the last week here. And it's something that I don't think that, there's always this specter of separatism that different people like to raise, especially with political interest in it. But this is not something I don't think that the Armenian government has any interest in, and has actually worked in the past quite a lot to suppress that and discourage that sort of idea. I think it's just, that Armenians worldwide, in Armenia and in the diaspora, is that the emotions are running so high right now as a result of this conflict. And it's viewed in this genocidal lens, of course. The Turks are coming back to finish the genocide against us. So emotions are very high. And then especially there is a dissatisfaction within Armenia, and I can imagine within Javakheti and Georgia as well, against the Georgian government right now. because of the fact that they have allowed Azerbaijani and Turkish planes to transit Georgian airspace to continue to bring weapons into Azerbaijan. And so there is this sort of dissatisfaction, discontent with it too. But I don't think that's liable to transform into anything serious. But then I think it's also important to consider, just how estranged politically and societally the Georgian Armenians and the Georgian Azerbaijanis are from Georgian society as a whole. I mean, the polling data for it shows that out of Georgian Armenians and Georgian Azerbaijanis, each of which is around 6% of the population of Georgia and live in fairly compact and geographically defined areas, only 20% of those people have any knowledge of Georgian whatsoever. And the rest interact entirely in their native languages and then in Russian. And so they tend to be much more oriented towards either Armenia or Azerbaijan, like professionally and work-wise, and they'll go find jobs in Yerevan, or they'll go to school in Armenia, or they'll go to Russia for it. And so these groups tend to be, somewhat fairly disconnected and estranged from the Georgian body politic as a whole. So it's not something that's necessarily indicative of Georgia's position on anything, but it's also something that exists in sort of a parallel space within Georgia.
Neil, I wanted to ask you, there are arguments that the recent flare-up is likely to last longer and is more difficult to resolve than the one in 2016. Do you agree with that statement? And if you do, why?
I think absolutely. And the main point is that, in 2016, it was also less intentional than this. It was also more accidental clashes that broke out and escalated. But then in 2016 too, there was still this relative military parity where, of course, Azerbaijan has been spending much more than Georgia on its military. Famously, Azerbaijan's defense budget is bigger than Armenia's entire government budget. But despite that, neither side got the clear upper hand, and that the casualties were about even. And especially, Armenia's terrain advantage being the defender, the Azerbaijanis clearly felt that outweighed any any ability of their technological advantages to make the prospect of a decisive advance on the ground unlikely. And but now for the first time in the 25 years, 30 years of this conflict, we've got an outside power, Turkey, coming down fully in support of one side here, the Azerbaijanis. And we've seen, especially, the Syrian fighters that are there and that we know are there because there's been, at this point, there's been videos of these guys in southern Azerbaijan, geolocated to different positions, videos of these guys in abandoned Armenian positions going through saying, Allahu Akbar, here's the war spoils of Armenia, and things like this, and interviews with the families back in Syria too. And these Syrian fighters have not really made a battlefield impact of that, as far as I can tell, but the Bayraktar drone definitely has. The ground situation is still fairly stable. The Azerbaijanis have taken a village, maybe two in the northeast, and then they've taken some ground in the southeast where it's essentially abandoned settlements. But the Bayraktar drone, just about every day, the Azerbaijanis are releasing multiple videos showing Armenian main battle tanks, Armenian rocket artillery, Armenian troop columns, and other military vehicles being destroyed by these. And so clearly, this is something that this additional element here, the Aliyev and the Azerbaijanis felt that, not only did they have the capability to do it here, but they were so disillusioned after 2016 that, the consensus is that the Russians convinced them that they'd be able to stop the fighting in 2016 because they'd be able to recover at least some of the territories through negotiation. And that this increasingly fell apart. After Pashinyan came to power in 2018, there was high hopes for him, but then, the domestic political demands of the conflict are such that it's basic. Pashinyan or any other Armenian leader, essentially, in order to be seen as legitimate, essentially has no choice domestically but to take a maximalist position on it, and to say, Karabakh is Armenia, and we will defend these lands forever. And this was especially true of Pashinyan because he was the first leader since the Levon Ter-Petrosyan in the 90s who does not come from Karabakh, who's not a member of the military establishment there. His two predecessors, Robert Kacharyan and Serge Sarkisyan, were both military commanders, both from Stepanakert, and both war heroes and part of this Karabakh generation, this Karabakh leadership that really captured the political establishment of Armenia for many years. And so this was naturally the main source of domestic pushback against Pashinyan, as he has no experience in this. You know, he was a journalist and he was an opposition politician, lifelong essentially, and he really had to push back against this. This was his main source of criticism, was this nationalist. You're not committed. You're not someone we can trust to defend the best interests of the nation, which is keeping Armenia and Karabakh as together and defending the homeland and the status quo as it currently exists on the ground. And so essentially, once he ended up making these statements, you know, going to Karabakh and giving these speeches, like Karabakh is part of Azerbaijan, or Karabakh is part of Armenia forever, and Karabakh and Armenia are one. I think that at that point is when the Azerbaijanis really started to lose any interest in the dialogue. And even for the last year before this, you know, there was the European Partnership for Nagorno-Karabakh, Peace Partnership for Nagorno-Karabakh. This program expired. There was a real delay in putting in a successor. I'm not even sure the one was ever implemented, because the Azerbaijanis were essentially seeing, you know, we don't think there's any point in negotiations anymore, especially with now we've got a new leader that had the revolution, but we still don't see any possibility.
But they kind of have a point, don't they, Neil? I mean, it's understandable why Azeris have been so frustrated. That's one of the reasons why it really makes, I mean, compared to 2016, I think there's less hope on the Azeri side to expect any kind of resolution. It's been abandoned by the West. The US hasn't really been there too much involved. So you could understand the Azeri frustration there.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, especially because this is something that, you know, the government says it, but this is also a feeling among society writ large, is, you know, this has been one of the definitive issues of basically Azerbaijani national identity since they became independent. And so I mean, Karabakh itself, in terms of the former Nagorno-Karabakh Autonomous Oblast, you know, the specific territorial unit in Soviet times that was majority Armenian, 75% ethnically Armenian in 1989, is one thing, but then there's the 7 occupied regions around it, which were, you know, 95% ethnically Azerbaijani, and the population was driven out of those during the war. And you know, there's the commonly cited figure is 800,000 internally displaced people in Azerbaijan. And that's from the occupied regions around the Karabakh Oblast and from Karabakh Oblast itself, and from Soviet Armenia too. So from a number of different sources, but yeah, essentially the few times that they have come close, I think that there was always the sense that the Armenian side specifically was willing to entertain the handover of transfer back of some of the occupied territories, the 7 occupied regions around Karabakh itself. But the Karabakhis never were. The Karabakh political establishment itself would always torpedo this. And I mean, also understandably from their point of view, when you listen to the sort of rhetoric that comes out again and again from the Azerbaijani government in terms of, you know, claiming the entirety of the Republic of Armenia as the Western Azerbaijan, as the Yerevan Khanate. The narrative in Baku is that, you know, these were historical Azerbaijani lands that were settled by the Russian Tsarist authorities by Armenians in the 19th century in order to consolidate Russia's control over them, and the Armenian presence is illegitimate there too. So you can understand from the Karabakh side too, you know, why there would be so little trust towards the Azerbaijanis and so little willingness to give up these lands that in a lot of ways either sit as a buffer zone between Karabakh Oblast proper and the Azerbaijani territories, or they're on the western side and between the Karabakh Oblast and the Armenian border, and giving them up would mean basically encirclement of Karabakh.
Max, I want to ask you the next question before I turn to you, Victor. So what is the Russian red line here? What would prompt Russia to intervene?
Well, so definitely hard to tell when there's ongoing battle. What exactly? I mean, I think the usual red lines are, especially for Putin, is when you have your troops attack, right? And there's a Russian military base in Gyumri in Armenia. We've seen over the last few days there was some cargo transferred, because Armenian border with Georgia is closed for Russia. There's a large cargoes going through the Caspian, through Iran, to Armenia, and you just see transfers of some cargo via the Caspian and Iran to Armenia. You don't really know if that's for the Russian military base there or whether for Armenian troops, right? It's not really clear. But I think attacking troops is definitely a red line. I think both in Azerbaijan and Turkey understand that attacking Russians to bring them in is a no-go. I don't think there is a certain kind of political red line, and equally, I mean, it's just exactly what I started off with by saying that Russia is right now creating both kind of this political narrative and the legitimacy around its potential bigger involvement in the conflict, so that it still maintains this role of the mediator, because it thinks that even if Turkey has now reasserted its role in the conflict, Turkey cannot be perceived as totally impartial, given its one-sided support for Azerbaijan. I personally think Erdogan doesn't see this as a problem, because Assad is also perhaps not happy with Turkey sitting on the Astana group, and Haftar openly sabotaged a lot of decisions that that third parties, including Putin, negotiated with Erdogan. That really didn't strip Turkey of its role in either Syria or Libya in that sense. So I don't think he thinks this is a problem. But for Moscow, I think being hit directly militarily is kind of something that the Russian leadership wants to dodge. But probably there was this question here that what exactly can be done. I don't frankly think can be more done politically and diplomatically than the 4 UN Security Council resolutions and multiple declarations, or the Madrid Principles, the Kazan Declaration, all these kind of settlement initiatives that Russia either initiated or had a large role in. But perhaps one of the fallouts from this particular war is perhaps that the line of contact, the contact line is gonna change. And Neil mentioned, there were some captures by Azerbaijan forces, and that, I don't perhaps see them giving those back. But at the same time, I think the Armenians can, what we're at least here in Russia is that, given the military superiority that Azerbaijan have, they aren't doing really well. And that if there was this kind of view that they may capture some of the lands, or recapture some of the lands rather, the blitzkrieg didn't really work. And to a degree, it works to the interests of Armenia and Russia to that extent, because it will perhaps make the military solution even more impossible the more the war rages on.
Victor, did you want to say something?
Yes, it was just a small comment, but quite meaningful in relation to what Neil has mentioned about cargo shipments, etc., etc. So I should necessarily add for our listeners and our viewers that it was not just a service, peace brokerage services which Tbilisi has offered, but the recent decision by Georgia Security National Council, which effectively suspended transit of military cargoes through Georgia, and that's also very important, because it's not just about this statement, but it's also about trust building measures. When you try to position yourself as a mediator, as a peace broker, certainly that statement should entail several other actions which could boost up your profile as a mediator. So that is very important, and that's a very important feature which Georgians have built into the overall context.
Well, there are lots of questions on Iran. Where does Iran stand on all this? There are reports that they have been transferring weapons to the Armenian side. So anyone can jump in. Where does Iran stand?
let me just quickly mention perhaps that there is entire, this kind of a separate Israeli-Iranian dimension to this as well. The Israelis have been, traditional military suppliers to Azerbaijan even before the war. Drones and all types of this technology. So there is this kind of unlikely "quote unquote" alliance, right, between Turkey, Azerbaijan, and Israel, even though it's not perhaps the state of Israel necessarily. There might be companies, Israeli companies, selling weapons to Azerbaijan. Iran has been very cautious. On the one hand, its top leadership, say the top advisor to the Supreme Leader Khamenei, Ali Akbar Velayati, mentioned yesterday that Iran is on the side of Azerbaijan, trying to restore territorial integrity. Their primary concern is that Azerbaijan perhaps does not go entirely under the domain of Turkish control, that they still trying to kind of maintain this Shia connection with Azerbaijan, and also ensure that the large Azeri population on the Iranian territory isn't agitated by all this military activity on the other side of the border. On the other hand, Tehran is rather taking a neutrality which rather favors Armenia. So I think Iran is trying to play on several chessboards here, in that it wants to make sure that, as I mentioned, Azerbaijan does not become even more dependent on Turkey. But on the other hand, it wants to ensure that Israeli weaponry is not going to end up in this kind of in its immediate neighborhood, because back in the day, Israel had this kind of encirclement strategy by having friend relations with countries neighboring Iran, and Azerbaijan was in the loop, so to say. So there is also kind of testing forces and testing strategies for potential clash, but through kind of this conflicts that both Iran and Israel are involved in. And I'll end just here, perhaps.
If you don't have anything to add to what Max just said, there's a question for you, and that is about the potential implications of the conflict on the Western strategy of decreasing Europe's energy dependence on Russia. So if the conflict goes on, do you see significant implications for Europe and its energy needs?
I mean, it's possible, yeah. There are the reports that that the Karabakh forces fire the missiles at near the Turkish pipeline, or the Azerbaijani Baku Tbilisi Ceyhan pipeline. There's definitely, that definitely is something that could be a risk. The Karabakh leadership itself has said that they're going to target, that they're going to start targeting strategic infrastructure like this because of the shelling on Stepanakert and because of the bombardment. So they have threatened this sort of stuff. I don't think it will go. I don't see it going super far, because even though the Karabakh leadership may want that, the Armenian leadership, I think, definitely does not. This is part of the reason why the fighting in the July, especially, I think, was able to come to a halt easily, because that was in closer to the area where this pipeline is, and it just near critical infrastructure for both sides, in that along the border region near Tovuz on Azerbaijan and Tavush and Armenia. With on the one side there, you've got the two pipelines coming, the oil pipeline and the gas pipeline coming through Azerbaijan. And then on the Armenian side, you've got the main north-south highway through the country going from Yerevan to Tbilisi. And so, this conflict is, it's coming to the point where it's starting to spiral, and it's all-out war, and is being seen as existential for the Karabakhis, increasingly, especially the Karabakh, the Armenian leadership. And so I don't rule out the possibility that they could do something rash and really try and damage this infrastructure. I don't think it's likely, but the longer this goes on, or maybe it increasingly, if they start to feel like their position is increasingly desperate or untenable, it's definitely possible.
There's a question for you, Max. It is that's linked to what I was trying to ask you earlier. about the Russian red line. So the question is, would Russia consider direct military involvement that includes ground troops or air support on behalf of Armenia, or would they not want to risk their relationship with Azeris, or I guess with the Turks?
Well, definitely. I mean, the bottom line, the key to success of Russian policy in the South Caucasus is to play effective balancing policy with all players. Well, I mean, with all, but I mean, by that, I mean, Armenia and Azerbaijan. It's pretty much lost out on Georgia right now, at least for some time. And it really has to play this balancing policy. For Turkey, in a way, it's easier because it's the key to success. The Turkish policy is in the scale of its military and political support for Azerbaijan and other Turkic-speaking ethnic groups in the region. So in this sense, Russian strategy is harder to implement than that of Turkey. But that said, I'm pretty sure the military has all kinds of scenarios, including the ones that they were asking the question. It's just, that deploying ground troops and providing direct military support is such the last resort, perhaps employed when the things in the conflict are going to get so bad for Armenia that it really demands, salvation. I don't think we're there, and I don't think we're going to get there, frankly. To my mind, Armenians have been doing pretty good job in terms of defending and with the means that they have. Plus, they haven't even employed a lot of the Russian weaponry, including some of the, latest aircrafts and jets and missiles and many other things that the Russians have supplied to them. So there's still a lot of reserves for Armenian military. I'm pretty sure for Azeris as well. But I'm saying this only to say that there's still. I mean, in theory, all these kind of scenarios are possible. I'm pretty sure the military has them in mind. But I don't think we're there, and we're not. I don't think we're going to get there.
What is an acceptable middle ground for Russia? Actually, for everyone. Neil, we were talking about parties making concessions, and Victor, you can weigh in on this as well. So, what would be an acceptable middle ground? For instance, would Russia be okay if Azeris just captured a few places? How would Armenians respond? So moving forward, if you want to bring the parties to the table, what would be a likely scenario in which parties say, okay, this is acceptable to us?
I think that is the real question, because with all the implications and ramification of the conflict, the real question is how the hostility would end up. Because eventually they would end up. Every war ends, and what happens next? So that is a real question. And therefore, when I've been speaking that this conflict has transformed from the ethnic conflict to geopolitical conflict, what could be those layers of respective terms and conditions? Would the same, the Madrid principles would be enough for stopping hostilities and bringing Azerbaijan and Yerevan? Would that be enough for Baku at this point? So therefore, it's very much depends, on the dynamics of offensive and defensive. And at this point, frankly speaking, who does what and who does any better? It's really very difficult to judge because there's no reliable source of information on either side. And that's, by the way, the very first flare-up in Armenia and Azerbaijan conflict, when the cyber war, the tactics has been involved. So it's really very difficult to judge, and each side is sort of packaging its own information to sell it and to present it the best way. So I fully share your point, Ganil. What could be those magic formula which would accommodate? Because from my standpoint, Azerbaijan appears to be quite resolute to go ahead as much as practicable, especially when it's by Turkey for the first time in the history of Nagorno-Karabakh conflict. So that's real. And then the second related question, unfortunately, that disorder of international law which does not provide, clear answer when it comes, to keeping territorial integrity and the same principle of self-determination. So which one stands in priority to another, and how, when those two comes into conflict. I'm not talking specifically, with the purpose now, whether Nagorno-Karabakh, is the case for self-determination or not, but how that disorder, that absence of magic recipe in international law and order should be sorted out. That's a real question. And but I think that's to be bold enough in my projections. I think that the likely formula for ending up the conflict would be somehow regaining the control by Azerbaijan over the adjacent regions, the buffer regions of Nagorno-Karabakh, and then at the first step, and the very first step, bringing parties to the table, going on with discussing, the fate. I'm not saying the status, because at this point, every single definition could backfire. The fate of Nagorno-Karabakh and Armenian population in Nagorno-Karabakh.
Neil, what do you say?
Yeah, I think, the biggest determinant as to what could stop this current war that's going on, this current round of fighting, the biggest question is, how much does Ilham Aliyev mean the things that he says? Because he says, and his administration says, and actually Turkish officials say that the same thing, is they keep saying, we're going to liberate all of our occupied territories. And in that sense, meaning they are saying they're going to military reconquer the entire Nagorno-Karabakh Republic as it exists right now. And this has been the line throughout the entirety of all 11 days of the conflict now so far. And the question becomes, to what degree does he mean that? And at what point can he afford to, will he back down, or will he feel like he can't lose face domestically by doing this? Because this is a big political risk for him as well. And that, the previous two administrations before his father, Heydar Aliyev, Mutalibov and Elchibey in the early 90s, both were toppled as a result of military failures in the front line in Karabakh. And then even we saw it after the July fighting, where it seemed that Azerbaijan got the worst of it, or at least for the first time since the 90s, a major general was killed in the Azerbaijani side. And this resulted in a mass spontaneous demonstration in Baku that started out as a pro-army demonstration and morphed into protesters calling for the resignation of different officials and different army generals. And so this is it's a big political gamble for Aliyev as well, and I have to think he's aware of that. But also, he's saying we want to recapture everything. We will recapture all the lands. In about a month's time, Nagorno-Karabakh is going to be covered in snow, and the advances that they've made so far, they've been slow, and they've been on the flat areas. The flat areas where it's possible, it's much easier to advance. So if this gets in, if we're here a month from now, and the mountains in Nagorno-Karabakh are all covered in snow and it's winter conditions, then that means you've got 5 months where it's essentially, I think, impossible to see any military advance by Azerbaijan. And what happens at that point? Do we just settle into some pattern where it's just Azerbaijani artillery sitting there pounding Stepanakert for 5 months? What happens at that point? The clock is ticking in terms of just pure weather factors alone for this sort of for the military operations, and then the political goals they put behind them as well.
Max?
Sure, thank you. Few things. There are 3 basic mediation strategies when it comes to any conflicts. One is where the mediators are trying to propose a set of ideas to the parties in conflict and see whether they can, work with them. The second one is you're creating a sort of conditions for the parties to discuss, and come up with their own ideas and try to implement them. I think over the course of the years, for almost 30 years, all of these kind of strategies have been tested. Different, the Madrid principles that my colleague mentioned were introduced, that the parties try to use that. Definitely, the returning the control over the 7 areas around Karabakh back to the, Azerbaijani government. It was one, key element to all of this. And then, but there was always a view on the Armenian side that this is, is a precondition. It's not going to work. It can be done in return for something else. And Azeris think it is a precondition for any other talks, since these are, kind of quote unquote genuine Azeri territories. There was also an idea of trying to, pull back the forces as military forces from as far from each other as possible, and have, say, Karabakh, quote unquote, demilitarized zone, or the other areas, demilitarized, to have the huge buffer zone between the parties. That hasn't really, played out as well. So I think there's this third strategy that they might employ, and now with this kind of Turkish more proactive role in the region as well, is that when the mediators or the third parties are coercing the parties in conflict to sit at the negotiating table and accept the conditions imposed on them, and you just stay where they are, whether Russia and Turkey, or Russia or the Minsk groups, or whether Turkey can become a co-chair of the Minsk OSCE group, can serve as guarantees for this type of deal, is of course an open question. And I'm saying all of this, giving that the fighting would have been stopped, where it still continues. So definitely number one priority is stop the fighting, and then do all the things that I just discussed. But one key point here, I think there is always kind of a tendency in these types of conflicts to refer to external parties so that they have kind of a magic wand, and do something and solve the I think this conflict has been so much, ultimately I would perhaps go as far as to say that the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict for both Armenia and Azerbaijan had been a key element in their post-Soviet identity. It is not just a fight over land, a piece of land. It's just the entire kind of huge layers of issues that are just beyond control of any external parties. That's not to say that in Russia or other external parties should not take responsibility for their own commitments and stuff, but I think there is a lot of work that perhaps should be facilitated for this kind of reconciliation dialogue and many other formats that genuinely, that the leaderships in Yerevan and Baku were that they stop, using the conflict to galvanize their own populations and support and their own political future in their countries. So there's tons of work to be done by all the parties, and I think by the parties in conflict themselves.
But given how distracted the Europeans are, certainly Americans, they haven't really been involved as forcefully as parties would have liked. So given that, and there's also a question here from the audience regarding that. The question is, co-chairs of the Minsk group are the countries that more or less support Armenia because of the strong positions of the Armenian diaspora. So how optimistic are you? And this is a question to all of you. How optimistic are you for a renewed diplomatic process that's led by the Minsk group?
I'm optimistic in that I don't think the military option is going to get Azerbaijan far. They will ultimately have to come around the table. So I don't think the current war is about, retaking the land as Aliyev claims. It is just about tipping the status quo a little bit in favor of Azerbaijan, because there's a view, and I think not an unreasonable one, that the status quo has been largely in favor of Armenia in the conflict. So now that Azerbaijan has this direct support of Turkey, it feels that it can keep tip the balance in its own favor, and kind of restart the negotiating process from kind of a new positions where it has a little bit stronger presence on the ground, a little bit kind of stronger political weight. So in the sense, I agree with the question from the audience, because ultimately Aliyev's call for Turkish support is a sign that he thinks that the Minsk co-chairs are biased towards Armenian positions, and he thinks that enlisting support of a powerful regional country such as Turkey that'll be advocating for Azeri interests, which may happen or which may not happen, because I think Turkey isn't that for itself, frankly. So I don't know.
Neil?
Yeah, I'm heartened by Maxim's response in that I'd love to see it as, Aliyev is using this as like a negotiation tool, and he doesn't actually mean what he says, and that he wants to militarily reconquer the entire region, which would I think there's no way that's not a humanitarian disaster. The Minsk group is something where at this point there needs to be, without some serious infusion of political capital by Western countries, and especially the U.S. But the U.S. is unlikely. I mean, it doesn't look likely anytime soon for that to happen in election season, and then the lame duck, 2 months before the waiting for inauguration. And I'm not sure to what degree that the EU can even play that role by itself, And so I think it in a lot of ways it'll end up being the current sort of war fervor and the current sort of mood in Baku and in Ankara will have to die down a bit, and I think it'll have to come to the point where they themselves start to realize or start to scale back what their demands are, or start to scale back what their ambitions are from this current offensive here, as the weeks grind on, and assuming there's not some massive breakthrough, which I don't think is super likely for them, especially the weather conditions continue to worsen. I think that's going to be the main determinant of it, and not, unfortunately, any sort of diplomatic measures.
Victor?
Okay, so let me speak, from the standpoint of the country which has offered to mediate, to put myself in this way. So the connotations like all-out war, or let's go till the end, they're not sustainable anymore from the point of the modern warfare. This is very important to remember. So if either party puts its bets, on getting to those ends and reaching those ends, it's not sustainable. It would backfire. That's one point. It's very critical to remember when we're speaking when we're discussing possible scenarios of continuing. Now, conflicts, of the similar type, they end up either in the first 72 hours, or they transform into the trench war with a never-ending result. So that's one point. And the second point, and the key point, which I should necessarily make during this discussion, that we're discussing the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict. We could be discussing with the same success the conflicts in Abkhazia or in the so-called South Ossetia, but those are the byproducts of weak political systems in the South Caucasus. These are the real roots, of the problem. So we should be looking, deeper into the anatomy, how those conflicts are erupting, what are the basis, what are the preconditions. So the weak political systems, alongside with the heavy domination of regional actors, that's what makes, the South Caucasus as a Pandora box, if you will. So I think that my appeal to international, and our common appeal to international community should be investing into sustainability and resilience of South Caucasian nations in their political and economical system. That would be the best preventive step in avoiding conflicts, like Nagorno-Karabakh or any other. So that would be looking at addressing the problem, in the long-term run. Ceasefire would eventually happen, but then would be another flare-up. So I think, the fundamentals of the region should be taken care of, and those fundamentals are in the vulnerability, in the high exposure, or in the sort of fractured nature of the fabrics of the political systems, and that should be taken care of.
Well, let's end with that. Let me thank our panelists for taking the time to join us today, and thanks to our viewers for listening to us today. And please check out the Middle East Institute's Frontier Europe Initiative program for more programs like this, and see you next time.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.